We are going to begin in Washington for the second public January 6th hearing.
Testimony today focused on the so-called big lie in which former President Trump repeatedly asserted that the 2020 election was stolen. The hearing was delayed after the committee learned former Trump campaign manager Bill Stepien would not testify today as planned. His wife is in labor. As a backup plan, the committee aired clips of a deposition that Stepien had given prior.
The committee did hear in-person testimony from former Fox News political director Chris Stirewalt. Now, Chris was let go by Fox shortly after the 2020 election, during which, in his coverage, his team correctly called the state of Arizona for Joe Biden and called it before the other networks did, angering the president. Since being let go, Stirewalt has said Fox News contributed to people believing that the election was in fact stolen. Today's hearing is one of 3 scheduled this week alone. Joining us now is CBS News political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns to continue the conversation. Caitlin, just big picture takeaways. You were watching it this morning into the afternoon with the rest of us. What did we hear that was new? What did we hear that could make a difference in terms of public perception and recollections about January 6th?
Well, Tony, it was really fascinating because we essentially heard an oral history of election night as it unfolded from the perspective of those closest to then President Trump, his campaign manager and his closest campaign advisors, as well as his daughter and son-in-law around the president. We heard that his campaign manager and advisors and attorneys were all telling him the truth about how the election was unfolding. They were telling him the truth in the weeks after the election, and they admitted to him that the election was, that they were not successful in this election. And what you had was, of course, the president refusing to accept that reality, refusing to accept those results, and going forward with these false claims of election fraud. Now, what's stunning here, and which I think is important to note, is that all of these people testifying today, his campaign manager, advisors, attorneys, the former attorney general, Bill Barr, they all had ample time over the past year and a half to say all of this publicly. They had ample opportunity to say all of this frequently, to make these points repeatedly that the president was spewing false claims. Because remember, not only did the president continue to raise money off of these lies, and the committee is trying to show that he incited an insurrection off of these lies. But this is important because this is continuing today. You have candidates running for federal and local offices who are saying that they believe the president's false claims about the election. And the important thing about that is that some of those people, if elected, could have jurisdiction over elections. The Republican nominee for governor in Pennsylvania is a top election denier, someone who championed these very things, who was at the insurrection. He would be in charge as governor of Pennsylvania, if elected, of appointing the Secretary of State who oversees elections. So the bigger takeaway, I think, from these hearings is, yes, it's giving us a full accounting of what happened on January 6th and everything leading up to it. But it's important to look at the bigger picture here, that this is something that is actually continuing on. And there's a segment of the Republican Party that is not only campaigning on this, but, could be in positions of power to continue this.
So, Caitlin, as you mentioned, these are all President Trump's closest advisors, people who are in these top positions, and among them, Attorney General Bill Barr. And tell us how consequential his testimony was. You mentioned he could have said something before now, and what we heard from him today really stands in stark contrast to the message that we received from former President Trump.
That's exactly right, Lana. And yes, this testimony that he provided to the committee is really important because it's essentially him, telling the president over and over again that there is just no evidence for all of these baseless claims of fraud. And it was really striking to hear some of these outrageous claims being made. And the president was hearing them, taking an audience with people that were putting them forward, and he was listening to them and promoting them. But what's significant about Barr, I went back to my reporting before the election, because I did a lot of reporting talking to election officials, talking to election experts about these claims that the president had been making before the election that there would be widespread fraud. And I went back to a story that my colleague Adam Brewster and I reported about Bill Barr himself promoting some of these false claims about the instance of widespread fraud before the election. He was saying without evidence that mail-in voting would lead to widespread fraud. He said that on a couple of occasions on Fox News and in an interview with the New York Times. And we talked to election experts at the time that essentially said that that is just not true. So it's important to note that while what Barr is saying in this testimony is really critical, he did have opportunities to say all of this publicly, and there were instances in which he contributed to questions about the integrity of the election. Now, he resigned, of course, in December of 2020. But he then wrote a book and talked about a lot of this in the book. But that wasn't until, I believe, March or so of the following year where he started to publicly talk about this. So I just think that's important to kind of lay out that you had people around the president that could have helped the public understand a lot of this and didn't. And that's how you have a segment. You know, our polling shows that a vast majority of Republicans believe the election was rigged, which, of course, we don't have evidence of.
Caitlin Huey-Burns, very much attached to reality this morning, in contrast to Bill Barr's description of his former boss, President Trump. Very astute observations, a recap of the morning's testimony and what it means for the president and also the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.